You're listening to the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast with Paula Engebretson, episode number 209. Hey there, what's happening? How are you? And if your brain is like mine and you just blew past that question as pleasantry, I invite you to pause and actually check in with yourself right now. How are you? Really? How are you feeling today? Are you tired? Are you energized? What emotion do you feel most strongly in your body right now? Take a breath. Remember, you have a body beneath your head. I say that a little bit joking, but also I mean it. Sometimes we forget. Check in with your body. It is so easy for those of us with ADHD and ADHD tendencies to really live up in our heads, just buzzing from one thing to the next. I know it all too well. And I also know that I always benefit from that reminder to pause and to breathe and to check in with myself. And if you benefit from that kind of reminder too, let this be one of them for you today. Check in. How are you right now? Okay. Today, what we're looking at is the topic of all or nothing thinking, which I think is part of the ADHD experience that is just not talked about enough. We tend to think about focus and attention and concentration and organization and time management, all of which are genuine obstacles for those of us with ADHD. But when it comes to our cognitive flexibility, our all or nothing thinking, our perfectionism, these are areas that just aren't talked about quite as often, despite how present they are and how much they can really impact our lives. So today, we're going to do kind of a quick overview first of what all or nothing thinking looks like generally, so that we're all on the same page. And then we're going to dig into 5 main ways that this all or nothing mindset tends to show up for us. Because by slowing down and developing this more nuanced understanding of these different categories and recognizing when this mindset shows up, we can then notice it happening more easily. We can start questioning it when it appears, and we can start deciding intentionally how we want to think about these different situations and these different experiences that do happen so often in our lives. Okay? But first, let's do that quick overview of all or nothing thinking. Make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is this? So all or nothing thinking is a very common thought pattern that we ADHD brains often navigate. It essentially involves us seeing things in more extreme terms with very little to no middle ground, very little room for flexibility. We're either good at something or bad at something. We love it or we hate it. We always do it or we never do it, right? And while there are many reasons why a brain can slip into this all or nothing thinking, I tend to see 2 key reasons that often come to the foreground for an ADHD brain. So the first reason is that we struggle with our executive functioning. So if we keep this in mind, you might see that we want to look at a big project for work, or maybe there's a big project around the house or something that you want to do. And our brain, when we see that big project, might think something like, well, I need to do the whole thing, but I don't have time to get started. It's going to take so long. Why bother getting started now? I don't have enough time. I can't do it all. Or I don't know where to start, right? There's too much. And the reason why the brain tends to think in this way is that it's literally more challenging for the ADHD brain to break down those larger projects into smaller parts. The brain doesn't naturally think to do this. It's used to seeing things in the big picture. So when we see that big project and we go, well, I just don't have enough time to do it all, it's because the brain has a really hard time breaking it down and seeing, oh, but I could just do this one part. Or maybe in a slightly different example, we plan to do something, right? We make a plan, but if a portion of that complex plan changes, it can be really challenging for the brain to adjust because it's struggling to see how all of those smaller parts of the plan can work together when that one component changes. So for example, let's say I worked really hard to map out some big elaborate meal. Okay. And there's different courses or lots of different sides or something that I need to coordinate the timing of. And then I learned that something's going to disrupt that plan, that timeline a little bit. Maybe somebody's going to show up late, or I need to keep something in the oven a little bit longer or something. If anything like that happens, it could be really hard for my brain to adjust to that plan. I just worked so hard to figure out all of those different timings and to figure out all the intricacies of that plan. And now I'm asking my brain to do even more work to just kind of switch on the fly to something different. And the brain will freeze up sometimes because it's so hard to have that flexibility to shift and make an adjustment when the brain has already worked so hard to create the plan in the first place. Because again, that's really demanding on our executive functions. And then more generally, we often just struggle with cognitive flexibility overall. And this basically means that our brain is just not naturally as flexible in terms of seeing the gray between the black and white options, or letting things be good enough rather than demanding perfection. So this is one reason why we tend to slip into all or nothing thinking more often, right? It's because we struggle with executive functioning. Now, in addition to that, many of us ADHD brains also navigate a lot of rejection sensitivity. And this means that we are much more aware of and sensitive to criticism, to rejection, to feedback, to judgment from others. And because we experience this so strongly, it can create this pretty intense fear and this desire for perfection. Essentially, we think that if we reach some level of perfection, even if we know that perfection doesn't technically exist, the brain still thinks if I can reach this level of perfection, it acts as protection from experiencing a painful experience of negative feedback or criticism or rejection. Because if we get it perfect, we can't be criticized. So because of this, we keep tweaking, we keep adjusting, we keep striving for this perfection, all in hopes of avoiding that pain of rejection. And as we'll talk about more in just a bit, I tend to see this category come up a lot in regard to both setting and reaching goals and this striving for perfection, and also in our interactions with other people. So again, this all or nothing thinking is a very common obstacle for those of us with ADHD and ADHD tendencies. And while it can absolutely be frustrating to navigate, we can have a lot of thoughts about it. There are absolutely ways that we can help create greater awareness of how it shows up, which then allows us to question the extremes when they do and gradually start seeing the gray more often between the black and white options that the brain usually offers us. So let's talk about how to do that. Today, we're going to explore 5 key areas where all or nothing thinking does tend to pop up quite often for our brains. And we're going to talk about how we can recognize these situations when they do occur, and what we might do to help us start seeing that gray more often between the black and white. And as you listen, I invite you to notice if any of these 5 categories sounds especially familiar to you, or whether your brain has any particular go-tos or favorites from the list. Mine certainly does. And in fact, as I was putting together this episode for today, it was really fascinating for myself just to see how I used to check every single one of these 5 boxes in nearly every situation. I mean, in true all or nothing form, I basically did all of them all of the time. And it was fun to see how much has shifted over the last several years, and also where I still have plenty of room to continue stretching and increasing my cognitive flexibility even further. So let's talk about this. We're going to start by talking about the 5 main areas where it shows up and how we can recognize it. And then at the end of the episode, I'm going to share how we can start moving through it and seeing the gray. So if you're hearing all of the ways it shows up and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do about it? Don't worry. We're going to talk about that at the end. But first, let's talk about these 5 different categories. The first area where I tend to see it come up is around the category of perfectionism, especially in regard to achievement and performance. So in these situations, your brain might think something like, unless you do the thing perfectly the first time when you start a new skill or you learn something new or you go after a big goal, it's not really worth pursuing, right? If you don't do it perfectly the first time, it's not worth trying. If you don't do it perfectly the first time, your effort doesn't count. I kind of think of it like the Hermione Granger mindset. You either get the hypothetical A plus in whatever it is you're doing, and anything else might as well be an F. And if you're not certain that you can get an A plus, your brain might prevent you from even trying, right? It's not worth trying if you can't get the A plus. For instance, I have worked with so many remarkably creative clients who really want to use their creativity more often. But they realize that they tell themselves, whenever they're making or designing or drawing or baking or whatever the thing they're trying out is, they tell themselves, well, it has to come out exactly as I envisioned it. It has to come out perfectly the first time. It has to come out just like the picture or the example on Pinterest. Otherwise, it's a failure. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. It's not worth doing it if it's not perfect. That demand for perfection is so strong for our brains when we're exploring this category quite often. And for many of us, when we're doing something new, when we're trying a new skill, learning a new art form or something, the chances of any of it being near perfection is, slim to none. And because of this, we never start. We have all of these things we want to try, all of these new projects we want to pursue. And then we have these impossibly high standards. We tell ourselves it has to be exactly right. It has to be perfect. And then we never even give ourselves a chance to start because when we're new at something, it's probably not going to be exactly like the Pinterest picture. So check in with yourself. Notice if anything I've just described here sounds familiar to you. Do you often think to yourself, you've failed or didn't do it right, so why did you even try? Do you tend to lose your motivation and your drive whenever you make a quote unquote mistake when you're doing something new or when you're doing something you're familiar with? Do you tend to lose that drive when you experience a setback or when things don't go as you initially envisioned? Similarly, notice if you struggle to see or acknowledge your progress, or if it's really hard for your brain to see your accomplishments as meaningful unless they meet that impossibly high standard, right? Like, let's say you make progress, but then you don't get the highest progress. Does your brain just dismiss that? Or is it able to see some of that progress, some of those wins? If it's struggling to see the wins, if it's struggling to celebrate your progress, if these situations sound familiar, it's probably a good chance that we've slipped into some all or nothing thinking in regard to achievement and performance and perfectionism and goal setting. All right. The second area where you might notice all or nothing thinking pop up is in your relationships and in your social interactions. So this, not surprisingly, has that strong connection to the rejection sensitivity that I mentioned at the top of this episode. So if you have a lot of all or nothing thinking in this area, you might find your brain seeing, one single interaction or one single comment that you made or someone else made within one interaction as a reflection of the entire relationship, or even your ability to react and interact socially overall, right? You might find yourself ruminating on the one thing you said and determine that you've destroyed the entire relationship or you've ruined the event or you're bad at peopling generally. I know that these examples sound kind of extreme, but let me tell you, it feels very real when you are in that rejection sensitivity spiral. When I say that the brain thinks you've ruined the relationship because of that one sentence you said, it feels so true in the moment. And if that is left unchecked, you might notice that it starts leading to stronger social anxiety, to greater self-isolation. You might struggle to form and also maintain important connections with others generally. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's been really fascinating for myself to see where I think I have made some pretty great progress and also where I still have plenty of room for growth. And while I do think I've made quite a bit of growth regarding seeing the gray in performance and goal setting and achievement and perfectionism, I definitely still notice all or nothing pop up pretty frequently when it comes to relationships and social interactions, especially when I am meeting new people in person. When I am forming new relationships and connecting with new people, my brain loves to go to the extremes at times like this. So take a minute and check in with yourself. Do you notice yourself slipping into all or nothing thinking when it comes to your relationships and social interactions? And you can check in with yourself and pay attention to how you're feeling before and during and after interactions with other people. Notice if you find yourself catastrophizing minor conversations, or if you're spinning out on something that you said that, someone else might not be thinking twice about, or something that someone else said that is probably something they just said in passing and didn't mean anything by, but your brain hooked onto it, right? Notice if you are interpreting a smaller disagreement or a differing opinion as a total and complete breakdown of the entire relationship, right? So notice when it's those extremes. And if you're noticing them, make note, because those extreme thought patterns may be a sign that we want to step back. We want to question that all or nothing thinking, that black and white thinking, and start looking for the gray. Is it possible that we could look at this in another way? In the end, it might be that you want to look at it at one extreme or the other, but let's slow down and take a look. And again, at the end of this episode, we'll talk about specifics and how to do that. But that's the second category, is in relationships. The third area where I tend to see our all or nothing pop up quite frequently focuses on making decisions and solving problems. So this can appear in a couple of different ways. First of all, let's say that we're trying to solve a problem and we're having a hard time finding that middle ground or seeing any other solutions in that given situation. So let's say I'm trying to solve a scheduling issue at work and I find two options. I can either do this or that. And then I find these two options and my brain stops looking for anything else, right? My brain loves to latch on to those two options. And then I completely miss the fact that I could solve that same problem with options C, D, E, F, G, or H. But I miss it, right? Because I feel so caught between just these two options, I completely miss the fact that I have all of those others available as well. Instead, I'm just focused on these two options, both of which I'm not super stoked about either, right? So I'm just trying to choose the option that's the least terrible instead of opening my eyes to see all of the other options as well. Now, the other way I see this show up when it comes to decision making and problem solving is kind of the opposite, where we do see all of the different options, right? We see A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We could do all of these different options. And then our black and white all or nothing thinking comes in and it goes, but hold on. You have to make sure you choose the right option. You have to make the best decision. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to do the wrong choice. And our brain, rather than realizing that there's a whole bunch of options, all of which could work, we're convincing ourselves instead that there is one right decision. And since we don't know which one is quote unquote right, we tend to spin. So not surprisingly, this can lead to a lot of indecision. It can lead to a lot of overwhelm and a lot of avoiding decisions altogether. So how do we know if this is showing up for us? How do we know if this is a present category in our mind? Well, in this situation, I invite you to start noticing when you feel like you're trapped between only two options. When you hear yourself saying, well, I have to do this or this. Notice when you feel stuck, thinking to yourself, well, we can either do this thing or that thing, and that's it. Or when you think to yourself, I have no idea what to choose because I don't know which option's right. What if I choose the wrong one? Right? I want to make sure that I choose the best option. I don't want to choose the wrong thing. If you notice your brain offering any of these different thought patterns, it's probably a strong indicator that there could be some gray area between our black and white, or all or nothing. And so we could maybe slow down and start looking for those other options in between. Now, the fourth way that we tend to get stuck in all or nothing thinking is around establishing habits and routines. So our brains love to see habits and routines as very absolute. We love to see it in very black and white terms with no middle ground, no shades of gray. For example, if you're trying to establish a new habit, like I'm going to meditate for 5 minutes a day, and you miss a single day, your brain may want to latch onto that and see it as a failure and think, ugh, you've fallen off the wagon again. There I go again. I can't even do 5 minutes a day. Why do I even try? I've blown it. Right? And our brain really gets hard on us for not doing it, quote unquote, perfectly, sticking with it 100% of the time. Or maybe you're thinking about establishing a new morning routine, and you've heard people talk about the importance of starting small with a new routine so that it's manageable and you're doing just one small thing that you can stick with most of the time, but your brain really resists that because when you think about it, your ideal morning routine requires at least 2 hours, and it involves journaling and meditation and movement and reading. So when you think about, okay, so I just need to start with 3 slow breaths when my coffee brews in the morning, your brain just kind of scoffs. It's like, what? Are you kidding me? 3 breaths? What's the point? That's not even going to do anything. It doesn't even count. I need at least 2 hours. So my guess is you've probably noticed this flavor of all or nothing thinking with habits and routines somewhere in your life, just because so many of the people who listen to this podcast are often looking for ways to lock in new routines and habits. And you've probably done that too. So notice if you have this all or nothing thinking here. Notice if you have that energy of telling yourself you've fallen off the wagon because you missed a couple of days of a new habit, right? Notice when you're telling yourself, oh, I have to start all over. Does your brain offer thoughts like, well, you got to just start at the beginning, or doing a little bit doesn't actually count. Don't just do a little bit. That doesn't count. It doesn't do anything. Maybe you hear that phrase, doing something is better than doing nothing at all. And your brain goes, you have to do it perfectly, right? Any of these situations are all beautiful indications that all or nothing thinking may be driving the ship of your new habit or goal. All right. The final way that I tend to see all or nothing thinking pop up for so many of us with ADHD brains is also probably one of the most painful examples that I tend to see. And this is when we are working toward a goal or a project that's particularly meaningful to us. And it's the tendency to tie up our self-worth and our identity in whether or not we're going to achieve that goal or complete that project. So we tend to get really hard on ourselves if we don't reach the goal because we make it mean that we're not good enough or we're not worthy enough as humans generally. You know, our brains somehow make this correlation that if we get passed over for the promotion or we don't reach our sales goal for the quarter or the article that we submitted was rejected from the top journal in our field, we aren't good enough as people. And we hold on to this version of this incredibly painful belief that if we don't reach our goal right away, or if we don't reach it at all, it means we're unworthy of success or that we're not good enough. And not surprisingly, in these situations, we tend to also experience a whole lot of self-doubt, a lot of insecurity, much lower self-esteem. We're often afraid to take risks, to put ourselves out there, because if things don't go as planned, it becomes a very personal reflection of who we are as people, which is incredibly heavy to carry around. So in this situation, I invite you to start observing whether you judge yourself often based on your individual outcomes or any setbacks you face. Do you tend to make whether you reach a goal or not, or complete a project or not, mean something about you personally? Do you believe that any type of failure or stumbling block reflects your inherent worth as a person? Or do you struggle to separate who you are and your identity from external achievements? If that's the case, you may, again, have all or nothing thinking challenging your self-perception here. And there's space that we can work through that. So check in with yourself right now. Do any of these 5 categories that we've just talked about stand out to you? If so, make note of which ones do. In fact, I'm a little tempted to just leave the podcast right here and have you think about this next week, building awareness of which of these 5 categories may be showing up the most for your brain. When do you tend to slip into all or nothing within these 5 patterns? Now, I'm not going to just leave you here because you all know I love action steps and I'm going to give you some action steps as well. But please don't skip this awareness part. It is especially important with the topic of all or nothing thinking because we need to have the awareness of where it shows up so that we know when to put the tools in place so we can start seeing that gray more often. Okay? So as you build your awareness and as you start noticing these tendencies of all or nothing thinking pop up, what can we do? What supports can we put in place? Well, first of all, one of the most important steps to navigating our all or nothing thinking is to start intentionally setting realistic expectations for yourself. So slow down and take a look at the expectations for the goal you set, or the routine you're establishing, or the relationships in your life. Ask yourself, are these expectations reasonable? Now your brain will automatically be like, yeah, and I should probably be doing more. So slow down. Would you happily give these expectations to someone else? Would you hold them for your best friend and expect them to meet them, or to someone else you love dearly? Would you say, here are your expectations, you must reach this bar, or you are not good enough? Now, if the answer is no, which I'm guessing it is, that's probably a good indication that it's time to check in and maybe play around with some adjustments. Start gathering evidence of how making mistakes might actually be a good thing as you're working toward a new goal, as you're learning a new skill. I know that sounds incredibly absurd, but if you start looking for it, I promise you, you can find evidence of that. Notice how times in the past when you've made a mistake, it's actually allowed you to learn and grow and do things better the next time. Show your brain how this is true. So again, check in with the expectations you have for yourself. Would you give them to someone else? If not, it's time to make some adjustments. And to help start making those adjustments, especially if there's expectations for perfection and never messing up, show your brain how in past, when you've made a mistake, when you've hit a stumbling block, show your brain how it's actually strengthened you and allowed you to grow. Now, if you're learning a new skill, rather than holding the expectation that you should have it perfectly the first time, maybe what you could do is start creating clear milestones for yourself. And again, make sure that these milestones are reasonable. And then as you go through the process and you're working toward these milestones, I encourage you to intentionally recognize and celebrate your progress along the way. Okay? So see that progress, set the benchmarks, make sure they're reasonable, track it along the way, and celebrate your progress. Celebrate your wins. Help your brain start seeing the gray between the beginning and the end, right? The start of the goal and the end of the goal. See the gray and all the wins in between. Now, the next thing that you can do to help you start noticing the all or nothing and shifting out of it is to pay attention to when you're speaking in extremes. And by this, I mean sentences like, I always do this, or I never do that, or I always fail at this, or I'm terrible at following through, or I'm never on time, or I'm the worst at meeting new people. These extreme qualifiers can really point to some all or nothing thinking. And when you see those extremes, you can start questioning them. You can ask yourself, but hold on, is that actually true? Do I truly always fail every single time at everything? And side note, I can guarantee you that that's not true. Actually, you didn't fail at pressing play on this podcast. You're listening to it right now. Win. Okay. So now it's your turn. Go start finding that gray and challenging those absolutes in other places as well. I promise you, doing just this simple exercise is going to help your brain start creating greater mental flexibility and seeing that gray. And you're going to start making more flexible thinking patterns your habit more often, right? Your brain is going to start thinking in that way more often because you're practicing it, because you're stretching, you're creating greater mental flexibility. Now, the third thing that I highly encourage you to practice as often as possible is cultivating greater self-compassion and kindness toward yourself. Now, I know for many of us, I might as well have just said, as often as possible, practice flying by flapping your arms really hard. I get it. Practicing self-compassion may seem completely a waste of time and totally out of reach and just not for you, right? It might seem like a soft, nebulous, squishy thing that only works for people who do yoga every day and live a super Zen life. I'm telling you that is not true. And in fact, that is just the all or nothing brain slipping in saying, well, that's for everyone else, but there's no way I could do it. There's no way I could ever practice self-compassion. That's just not possible for me. Hello, all or nothing thinking. I see you. But let's pause and question that. What if that's not true? What if it's absolutely possible to step into greater self-compassion and confidence? Notice when your brain wants to criticize you. Recognize what's happening. Go, oh, hold on. I see what we're doing here, but let's check in. Would I think this same thing about my best friend? Would I ever dare say anything like what I'm saying to myself to anybody else? I mean, to be honest, I think most of us wouldn't say what we say to ourselves on a daily basis to our worst enemy. I mean, it's heartbreaking, actually. So as often as possible, check in when you notice that critical voice and ask yourself, hold on, what would I be saying to my best friend or my sister or my child if they were in this situation? How would I show up for them? What would I be saying to them? And then lean into doing that same thing for you. And as an aside, if this feels especially challenging, okay, I want to normalize that. It is hard, especially if it's not well practiced. So check in. If you're finding it's really challenging for you, you could ask a safe person in your life for some of this perspective. Okay, so check in with that friend that you can be 100% you around and you feel so safe and so seen. Or a loved one who knows all of you and loves you even more for it, right? They love all of you. Or check in with your therapist or your coach who are there on your team and always see the best in you. Get their perspective. I'm telling you, it's so powerful and it's so helpful when your brain is really struggling to see it for yourself. I often say to my clients when they're starting to kind of exercise their own self-compassion and develop their own self-confidence, I say, you know what? You can lean on my belief as you develop the strength in yours because I see what's true. I see that you're busy being awesome. And if you need to lean on my belief until you see it too, until you strengthen your belief, no problem. I have more than enough belief for the both of us to go around. And the same is true for you. So with that, I invite you to stay open and curious this week. Notice if you have all or nothing, black and white thinking sneaking into your life. Is it around the categories of achievement and performance? Do you notice it regarding your relationships and social interactions? Does it come up with decision-making and problem-solving? Do you find it in establishing habits and routines? Does it appear wrapped up in self-identity and self-worth? Start noticing these areas. Start building awareness of when it pops up. And then use these 3 supports that we talked about today to start challenging some of them. Start seeing that gray between the black and white. I think you'll be amazed by how powerful making these small shifts can be. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you're ready to take these concepts deeper and apply them to your life, if you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that works for you, then I invite you to check out today's show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/group to learn more about my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome. If it sounds like a great fit for you, you can add your name to the waitlist and you'll be the first to know when enrollment opens for the next cohort. Also, have you grabbed the podcast roadmap yet? It has the most popular episodes all detailed for you so you can get yourself up to speed and ready to work with your ADHD brain. You can grab it now through the show notes or you can head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/map. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.